So, welcome everybody to Supply Chain Insights Anode Supply Chain webinar. We're going to go through about 20 slides today, really focusing on what the major trends are in this part of the supply chain. It's often overlooked in comparison to the cathode side of the supply chain. But what we're seeing now, certainly over the past couple of weeks, is a lot of projects that have previously stalled are starting to move forward. We're seeing a greater sort of geopolitical aspect to the anode side of the supply chain. And we're going to look a little bit with my colleague Mike on what legislation is driving that and the impacts that will have on some of the final investment decisions. And really for Mike, this is not just an interest, it's a passion for him. So Supply Chain Insights, we are a specialist lithium-ion supply chain research and consultancy. We focus on asset level due diligence projects, term sheet advisory for take or pay offtake contracts. Then we also have a subscription product which covers long-term supply, demand, price and cost forecasts across not just the anode, but also the cathode supply chains as well. Now, when we look at the anode, you can see why it is sometimes a little bit overlooked when people are focusing on supply chains and what parts they control, particularly when it comes to the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, who increasingly have been doing a lot more of the purchasing for their supply chains, where previously it was done by the actual battery manufacturers themselves. And you can see on the pie charts here, you've got two highlighted in red types of battery. So the anode active material costs highlighted in red there for a ternary cathode type cell. On the left-hand side, you're looking at 10% of the cost, more if you included the copper foil that is coated onto. But for LFP, again, slightly higher proportion of the costs because the cathode active materials are slightly cheaper. And again, even more so once you include that foil. But one of the key things here is that when we're talking about the anode side of the supply chain, we're not just talking about price risk. We're also talking about supply risk. So price risk is when you want supply chain because you don't want a situation where the price of your raw material quadruples, and that goes through and impacts the cost and therefore demand for your end use product, an energy storage device, or an electric vehicle. You also have supply risk, which is where you simply might not have that material coming into your supply chain. And if you don't have that one component, you can't build the battery. If you don't have the battery, you can't build the vehicle. So there's a huge amount of supply chain risk and supply risk that we're going to talk about. It's not just price risk when it comes to the anode side of the supply chain. Now, when we're talking about the anode side of the supply chain, we are talking about basically two different supply chains entirely. The first one is based on mined natural flake graphite. This is effectively, a crystalline form of carbon, which is found pretty much all over the world in one form or another. It is then mined and sorted into various flake sizes, some of which are not suitable for battery materials, some of which are suitable for battery materials. That flake is then effectively milled and processed into smaller round spheres. That's what we call spherical graphite. There's a huge amount of volume loss when you go through that process. Indeed, in some respects, with some flake graphites, you're looking at up to 2.2 tons of natural flake mined graphite to produce 1 ton of uncoated spherical graphite. From there, you have the uncoated spherical graphite. To increase the longevity of that material, you want to coat it generally in an amorphous carbon. There are some other technologies out there, and that will effectively increase the lifespan of that graphite in the anode. Why do we want it to be circles and not crystalline shapes? Well, that's all about being able to fit more into a lattice structure in the anode, so you just get more bang for your buck as it is coated. Sphericalized and then coated. That then goes to the anode active material manufacturer. Often they will do the coating themselves, and that is then sold on to the battery manufacturer. So that's the flake graphite side. You've then also got the potential for synthetic graphite. Synthetic graphite is effectively a byproduct, sometimes from coal tar pitch, but generally from petroleum coke, or green coke as it's sometimes called. And that is effectively some oil and gas, so some oil refineries at the end of the fractional distillation process, they will have something called a delayed coker, and that takes really at the end of the process and just produces a high carbon product that's often used in electrodes for steel making, for aluminum production, some other end uses. If it's got high sulfur and isn't particularly good, high in impurities, it could also be burned for fuel, although that happens less now. Now, again, what you do there is you process that further. You effectively heat the material up, you calcine it into a calcined petroleum coke, and then you move on to a graphitization process to create what we call synthetic graphite, which is then shaped as well. That material will also need to be coated in amorphous carbon to prolong its life expectancy, and then you go to the anode supply chain, to the anode active material manufacturers. Now, what are the pros and cons of each? So we look at natural graphite, and just say it's effectively, it's mined. There's large deposits in Africa, large deposits in North America, in Scandinavia, in Australia, in China. It's geographically pretty easy to find. It's also quite often, a relatively low cost mining operation. You're pretty rarely going to go underground to mine this. It's from near a surface mine with a relatively low stripping ratio. And that does mean that unlike other parts of the supply chain, it can potentially come on a little bit quicker than some other types of mining operations. However, it is a mining operation, so it will come with the environmental and permitting considerations and potential delays to bringing projects online that we see across all mined markets. Historically, but not always, natural flake has a lower cost than synthetic graphite. There's slightly less competition for that material and a slightly lower production cost in some cases, although it's sometimes difficult to tell with synthetic as a byproduct. The really important thing about natural flake, though, is that it is price elastic, in that in the long term, if you need more of that material, higher prices will bring more supply to the market. And that's less so the case in synthetic graphite. Now, synthetic graphite supply chains are often seeing, because it's not a mined product, it's a manufactured product, being seen as a more consistent product. I think that's probably falling away a little bit now, but historically had that slightly better reputation. And that meant that people were, sometimes willing to pay slightly more for the material as well. Now, as I mentioned, that is derived from needle coke primarily, which is a byproduct of oil refining. Depending on how you count your sort of carbon credits and carbon impact, you could see it as a high greenhouse gas product because it does come from oil and gas hydrocarbon refining. But the really important thing in the long term is that this is pretty price inelastic. You can add a delayed coker to some refineries. It's not always economic to do so. But ultimately, as we use less oil and gas in transportation going forward, you're not going to build more oil refineries to be able to produce a material that goes into electric vehicles. So over the longer term, we would expect natural flake to take more of a market share. And approximately, it's sort of 50-50 at the moment. The final point that's really important to stress is that you also blend these materials together in the anode. So, it's not just a case of choosing one or the other. You will quite often have, 50% of one, 50% of the other. Now, the carbon is not on its own in the anode. We're not really focusing too much on sort of additives and binders and things today, but, it's worth mentioning that there is some substitution pressure when it comes to increasing energy density. And generally, you'll probably be aware that as we move forward and as technology develops, what we want to do is increase the energy density in the cell, both from a volumetric and gravimetric basis. One of the easier ways to do that is a silicon additive in the anode. A lot of the cells deployed today will have, 4 or 6% silicon additive in there, going up to 20 or 30%. And indeed, there are companies out there who are moving forward with the deployment of pure silicon anodes as well. And then potentially we've got, the lithium anodes, which you may be familiar with solid state or semi-solid state batteries. Now, the important point with those, because we often see this as being got wrong in quite a few forecasts, is that when you increase the energy density or energy density capability in the anode, it quite often means that you just use less anode material. You can make the battery smaller, you can fit more into the same space. Incredibly important when it comes to transportation considerations. But it does mean that the growth rate on a megawatt hour basis when it comes to anode materials is quite often higher than when it comes to a tonnage basis. So very important if you are looking at these markets to always consider the megawatt hour and the tonnage side of things as well. Again, a chart you're probably quite familiar with, looking at the parts of the supply chain that China dominates. And really one of the key ones, if we look at what's on the anode side of the supply chain, you've got your natural graphite, huge producing provinces in China for natural graphite. There are some considerations around environmental concerns in China from the Chinese themselves, because it is a very dirty business, literally. If you look at sort of pictures of graphite mining operations, and there are some issues which could potentially restrict Chinese supply going forward. It's a relatively low value add product and high environmental cost. The processing of materials is where China really takes a huge lead. So, in making the sphericalization of the graphite, a huge amount happens there in China. Likewise, synthetic graphite. A lot of the Chinese oil and gas refineries will produce that, which produce the precursor to that. And therefore, you've got a lot of the synthetic graphite production happening in China, and indeed the anode production itself. Now, when we look at anode demand, it is important to note that it's not a function of how many vehicles are produced. It's a function of how many batteries are produced. So the consuming part of the supply chain for anode active material is the battery cell production. And if we look here at effectively battery cell production, that gives us anode active material demand by region. And so you can see here at the moment, about 10% of cells are being produced in Europe, about 10% in North America, and 80% from Asia, of which the vast majority are coming from China, but also Korea and Japan. And interestingly, a lot of the Korean and Japan raw materials for their anode production will come from China as well. Now that increases to 24% North America and 20% Europe with all the battery cell facilities we've had announced over the past couple of years. And what it means that is, if we go back to this chart and we look at that, we say, well, it's pretty shocking that China controls so much of parts of the supply chain. We don't need to get to China controlling none or even 50% of that. This is the part that we need to fill when it comes to the 2030 timeframe. But it does mean more needs to be done, because when we look at the total side of the anode production, we can see that only about 2% of global supply at the moment is coming from European and North American facilities. A lot of those don't really operate on a commercial scale. They're ramping up, they're having pilot plants at the moment. And what we'll do in the next few slides is we'll go through the individual parts of the supply chain. Where we put them all together, you can see here, the blue squares are operating assets in the supply chain, and the yellow ones are potential. And obviously, there's a lot more yellow than there is blue, which I think is a very simplistic way of putting what the message of this webinar is about today. So looking at natural flake graphite projects, both Europe and North America actually have quite a lot of potential when it comes to these supply chains. There's more that can be done. There's more that can be discovered. We've had some great projects, like Talga, that have been advancing. We've got a few producers already. Not all of them supply purely for the battery space. It should be noted. But all in all, it's a market where a lot of these projects really have stalled over the past couple of years. We've seen a bit of an oversupply in China. We've seen prices come down, and that's meant it's very difficult for these projects to get funded. And also, as we go through, what you see is the part of the supply chain that they want to sell to, the processing or the anode side, doesn't exist yet. So it isn't requiring that material. If you're buying your anode active material from China, you can't just produce natural flake. You'd have to ship it to China. And in some respects, that's what we saw when Syra Resources Balama mine came on. It was almost too big too soon, and a lot of that material had to go to China at a lower price point. So again, a lot of geological potential, but we're falling behind on the financial and commercial considerations, supply chain considerations at the moment. When we look at spherical graphites and some processing of the natural flake, again, not a huge amount going on. There are some projects moving forward. In Europe, I think they're going to struggle to get to that sort of unbinding target of 40% of processing capacity. It is theoretically possible, but you need a lot more development, and we're certainly many years away from getting there. In North America, slightly better proposition on that side. In particular, we've seen some movement and some funding coming in for Syra Resources Vidalia projects in Louisiana, and that effectively sources material from Mozambique and ships it to be processed in the US. And they've managed to sign, a couple of offtakes and MOUs in that supply chain as well. When we move to the synthetic graphite side, you can see there's quite a few more operating facilities. This is partly because a lot of these facilities are selling into markets, not just into battery markets. So, companies like Superior Graphite, they have a lot of end-use industries which are not just on the battery side of things. They are, however, open to Inflation Reduction Act spending, and Mike will talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and European legislation in a few slides' time. But again, the overriding thing is here, if you look at this map and the other maps that we've looked at, there's just a lot of projects out there which need to move forward if we're going to get anywhere near moving away from complete sort of Chinese control of those supply chains. Finally, on the anode facilities, again, lots of projects coming. One of the issues we often say when we speak to governments on this side of the supply chain is that research and development spending in labs and at universities is all well and good, but there's a lot to be said for internal R&D operating assets, where you're developing skill sets, where you're developing qualified labor, which you can imagine with all these supply chains, there's a huge labor shortage outside of China. We've seen that in lithium, we've seen it in other parts of the battery supply chain, that until you get that R&D happening, offshore production sites, and people learning how to commission these high-tech processing facilities, learning how to produce consistent materials which will meet OEM qualification standards and battery supply chain standards, there's a risk that Europe and North America will fall behind a little. Now, why is there some more urgency to this now? In October of last year, China announced that they would have graphite export licenses, and that they came in on the 1st of December. And while that hasn't necessarily restricted supply at the moment, you can very much take this in context of what's been happening in the sort of US-China trade conflict, or whatever you want to call it. We have seen the US cutting China off from chip technology. We've seen China sort of banning some rare processing technologies. We've seen the saga ongoing with various semiconductors as well. And I think this is kind of bringing EVs and EV supply chain into that sphere of competition. So in the EU, we have an investigation into Chinese EV subsidies. You can read it in the headlines every day about the concern that North American and European automotive manufacturers have about Chinese electric vehicles swamping those markets in the coming years, because they're quite often better and more advanced models which are updated more frequently. And what's clear is that China does have some levers that it can pull in that supply chain to try and cut off You know, anybody saying, look, you're not going to build, we're not going to import Chinese electric vehicles. They go, that's fine. You're not going to be able to build any electric vehicles if I pull this lever. It's probably not a lever, but you know, in my mind. So yeah, I think this is increasingly becoming a bit of a geopolitical football, and that in itself is probably positive for a lot of the yellow dots that we showed on the previous charts. And indeed, since that Chinese legislation came into force, we have seen quite a bit of movement, quite a bit of announcements, not just in funding, but also in offtake contracts. And if you're familiar with these webinars, you'll know that we quite often talk about the supply chain outside of China not really being built without a sort of take or pay offtake contract. It's very hard for them to get debt capital without those take or pay offtake contracts. Now we're starting to see movement there. And you can look at that as not just people realizing, or the industry realizing that they need to order this material locally, but also that it needs to get built. And each one of those offtake contracts moves the projects closer to securing the financing that they require to get built. And you know, certainly since the beginning of this year, you know, we've seen Westwater, Novamont Graphite, you know, all announcing really positive supply offtakes and additional financing. Some more announcements, I'm sure, coming from the Loan Program Office in the US. So lots of things moving forward there. Mike, I'm going to pass over to you just quickly, see if you've got any comments to add on this slide, or indeed any of the others that I've already spoken about.
No, thanks, Andy. Yes, this is, you know, in February alone, we've seen really some quite serious announcements from those three companies you mentioned: Novamont, Westwater, and Novonix. Over the next few years, that's about 80,000 tons of material they've announced as going on, as being supplied to, you know, serious tier one off-takers, people like Panasonic, GM. These guys are buying 80,000 tons of it, all produced in the US, and they're going to all try, and I'm sure benefit from the 45X tax credits that we'll talk about a bit later on. But no, I mean, February really has been sort of like a demonstration of how this is really starting to get more serious, probably spurred on by one, Chinese announcement of export license back in October, and two, these 45X regulations being announced by the IRS in early December or mid-December of last year.
And then, Mike, do you want to carry on looking at just a bit of the background to the EU and US legislation and the impact of that when it comes to the anode side of the supply chain?
Certainly. I think the sort of the US versus EU legislation funding story is almost sort of one of either success versus, I won't call it quite failure, but certainly lackluster performance. We're seeing an awful lot of investment decisions go into the US, not just in terms of anode supply, but generally battery and the cathode chain as well. Perhaps more significantly on the cathode chain. We'll see if the anode side catches up. And I think it's very interesting to look at how the two mechanisms work. In the US, it's, you know, the IRA, it's a very definitive act. And it's really been put into place, and yeah, the loan office in the US has really been active getting out loans. Grants have been awarded. It's been a sort of a single point source of legislation, a single sort of call to action, if you like, for a lot of these multinational companies, with, you know, the US very much being seen as the investment destination of choice for EV and battery supply chain. Europe has been, I would say, somewhat more muddled. It's had a sort of a raft of legislation approach in various different various sort of sections. It's not really been a consolidated approach. And as we'll talk about a bit, I think we'll see, you know, how they've not really managed to get anything like the investment decisions that the US has, and certainly not perhaps from the, you know, the big established names that the US has really managed to attract. So I think this is perhaps a slide I thought would be worth sort of looking at, how sort of the US and the IRA has really sort of managed to spur on investment in countries that can also supply into the US, not just US operations and US companies themselves. I think one of the things that I think it's really interesting to think about is because we have had obviously seen a lot of news on the cathode supply chain. You know, we've been talking about metals, particularly lithium, but, you know, nickel and cobalt as well how we get those really secured from various places in the world, and how we get them processed up to the very high standards of battery grade. I think what is really starting to bite now, as we look at the sort of like the graph on the left, and the IRA funding hurdles you need to make with sort of like in terms of the value of your critical minerals and your components going into your EV to get the relevant subsidies. We're getting to the point now where you cannot ignore the anode anymore. It is just more and more starting to bite. And I think after people have secured the metals, which was kind of the new and growing market, I think the carbon side of the battery is really getting that little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot more attention. And I think, you know, we're seeing that with the recent announcements, and I think we'll see more. The other thing I think it's really interesting to do, which was just, this was a piece of analysis we actually did for another project we did recently, but I thought it was worth sort of putting in here to sort of show what the IRA is forcing other governments to do. This particularly is the Canadian government and the provinces, in order to sort of hold on to some of the investments that a lot of the automakers were thinking of making in, particularly around Ontario and Montreal. They've really had to step in with quite high levels of funding. And this was just sort of a little piece of analysis we did where we sort of said, okay, so who essentially is paying for you know, these facilities? And what I think is very interesting to notice this in Canada, to step up to the IRA and retain these particularly OEM auto plants, has been, you know, they've got to find nearly 50% government, with just under a quarter coming from the provinces on average, and just over a quarter coming from the federal government. It's just the amount of capital spending, and also in the case of LG and VW, operational support has just been massive. So I think the IRA has not only sort of like prompted investment in the US, it's made other governments step up and, you know, really try and deliver. Canada, of course, has got perhaps the best agreement with the US, and also the longest established trading relationship of pretty much any nation of any size. So I think, you know, they've really felt this is coming in. Whether these provincial and government subsidies stay as they are, or whether it all gets much more standardized under the Clean Technology Manufacturing Credit, which is due to start later this year under the Canadian scheme, we'll see. But I think, you know, it's really does demonstrate, one, how serious governments had to be, and two, I think we shouldn't perhaps underestimate, you know, that one, there is federal government funding, and that's the case both in Canada and the US, but also the provinces have had to step up, not just necessarily with battery specific measures, but also, you know, making matched funding contributions from infrastructure development funds, industrialization funds, greening funds. That sort of matched funding has also been sort of a very key element of battery chain investment and new developments we're seeing. So Europe, where's it going? What's it doing? This all started out initially when there was viewed as sort of under COVID. There was the New Deal, or the European Green New Deal, I should call it. There were a whole raft of measures designed to sort of stimulate the economy. Part of it was sort of viewed as, you know, how do we generate, you know, not only economic stimulus, but do we do green economic stimulus, and sort of try and, if we're going to spend government money, do we move it towards a greener economy and a more sustainable one? There's a few pieces of legislation here that are sort of perhaps probably the 3 or 4 that really drive the battery sector, if you like. One, of course, is the Critical Minerals Directive. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but you can probably guess what that does. The battery regulations, which will supplant the old 2006 directive, that's going to be quite important. Some measures of that are coming in 2023 and have already started to bite. Full implementation expected to be by 2026, so it's sort of a gradual transition. The European Battery Passport, this is going to be really interesting to manufacturers. I think this is going to really tell consumers where their products are coming from. So you have to disclose not only your components of your battery to an extent for recycling purposes, also you have to talk about performance standards, and also how it's going to sort of be recyclable. I think that's going to be something that's going to be very interesting to sort of see, you know, can you drive that 25% recycling target in the battery sector using this? And then second, of course, oh, if I could have my slides back, thank you. Where you get that ESG score, which not only involves carbon footprint, but let's not also forget social responsibility and the governance aspects as well, which are increasingly driving consumer choice. Even if it's not legislative, it's going to give consumers the right to choose. And I think that will be something that drives scrutiny of suppliers, of manufacturers' supply chains. Finally, the sort of smaller one with this, which is supposed to have a big impact, but I think it's going to be actually rather small. You've got the cross-border adjustment mechanism, which basically sits there and says, look, okay, in Europe, we have to pay for our carbon. You can't get away with just sort of making your carbon-intensive parts in other parts of the world where they don't charge you for it. You'll have to sort of declare what your carbon footprint is at the border, and if it's too high, you'll get essentially a bill for buying the carbon somewhere else as if you made it in Europe. And next slide, please. So sort of two parts to this, really, I suppose. If we start on the right, this is a handy graphic, I guess. But what I think is interesting is if you look at the top two little blobs there in gold, you've got nickel and natural graphite. So undoubtedly, nickel is decidedly an important part of a battery, but also so is graphite. And if you look further down, you see lithium, cobalt, and various other bits and pieces that we would really like to see in our critical mineral supply chain, and also are important a lot of green technologies in the future. These are really what is driving that sort of, how the European Union looks at sustainability and how it tries to sort of be not totally self-sufficient, but not so beholden to external suppliers, whether that be sort of for its own processing, or whether that be from not being too dependent on a single source supplier. Notably, it's 65%, which is an interesting number because China sort of flirts with it. The other part of this is, considering we do want to develop these supply chains in Europe, even if it is to a limited extent, we've been really quite slow at developing these, and we've not really supported industry when it comes to getting these new facilities built. It was noticeable that back in January, the first really significant piece of member state aid was funded in Germany. Norfolk got their Haida facility funded to the tune of about 980 something million euros. So very significant funding, but we're still quite a lot later than a lot of the US funds that were started to sort of be rolled out late 22, early 23, early 2023. So we've lost 18 months, 2 years there. And I think it's also this funding is perhaps less concentrated as well. So that was a roughly $1 billion for Norfolk, and we've seen another sort of 3 billion, but it's in quite a lot smaller projects, and it's not always across the European Union either. So it's quite concentrated where this is occurring. So I think this very much highlights the sort of two approaches, and I would say still that North America in particular is really getting on with the can-do attitude, and Europe has been rather too legislative and somewhat further down the curve. Andy, I'll go
Great,
back.
thanks, Mike, and apologies for sabotaging your slides. I was trying to get an answer to one of the questions we've had in the Q&A. Please do answer as many questions as you like in the Q&A. Just a reminder that is live. But to sort of summarize on this part of the presentation, some of the key trends that we're seeing in the industry at the moment is, for me, after several years of, almost sort of atrophy in investment on the anode side of the supply chain, it is starting to move. We're starting to see a recognition that there could well be consequences for relying on one source of supply, China, when it comes to these raw materials and processed materials. And that's starting to see some offtake contracts and some final investment decisions. And I'm sure we'll see many more as 24 and 25 progress. One of the things that we get from speaking to automotive manufacturers is that their purchasing teams are now starting to move on to that sort of second tier of raw materials such as graphite and manganese. And I don't really do them down by saying, second tier. What I mean by that is, if you look at if you remember the first pie charts that we put up, your exposure on a dollar per kilowatt hour basis to lithium, and if you're using a ternary cathode nickel, is much higher than it is to the anode and some of the other raw materials. So they were the ones that prioritized. And now that those contracts are being signed or in the process of being signed, we're seeing a lot more movement come on other parts of the supply chain. And again, that's been given a big boost by the Chinese export license and the issues that we're seeing in rare earths, the issues that we're seeing in semiconductors, and then again potential fear that those could increase should there be a change in administration in the US early next year. As I say, I think one of the things to keep an eye on is definitely that potential for China to restrict supply. There are many levers that they've used in the past. This could be restricting the volumes that are exported, saying that materials are needed for domestic industry. That's happened in rare earths before, and that effectively pushes the prices up outside of China. Now, when you're pushing raw material prices up just outside of China, what are you doing? You're making Chinese electric vehicles even cheaper in comparison to those manufactured outside of China. So again, that's potentially a boon for them. You could also then see export taxes come on. So that's again something which has been very common for the Chinese government to do in the past when they want to restrict or have some control over exports. They can change the VAT rebate levels, export rebate levels. They can put on import taxes, and those decisions, they can happen almost overnight. You get a press release and it's enforced the next day. So again, something to consider. One of the other, or two of the other points I wanted to get through finally were that because these are supply chains which are really dominated by China, it tends to be that you only have China reported prices, certainly of any liquidity. And for the foreseeable years, you have a choice when it comes to pricing these raw materials. You can either try and come up with some mechanism that does link to a market price in China. There are a few companies which will have prices outside of China, but sort of a victim of the lack of liquidity at the moment. And then you can also have some kind of fixed cost plus element. We've seen that in other raw materials as they're at an early stage of development, and particularly where you're reliant on a take or pay offtake contract, that it might just be, okay, for this first stage expansion, we're going to guarantee that we can make some money, but we're not going to make a lot because it's going to be on a cost plus basis. Now, that has some benefits to it, particularly in relation to raising debt capital, where the debt capital provider has no upside anyway. It means you get built into a market which is doubling in size every 4 or 5 years. It's not a bad position to be in. It just means that you may take on the potential for high prices and super profits a bit later than you initially expected. So there's a lot of negotiations going on like that at the moment, and indeed, with the work that SC Insights does on term sheet and offtake contract advisory, it's something that we're quite heavily involved in. The other thing to bear in mind is that at the moment, despite the demand side being good and this big need for non-Chinese supply and to increase particularly investment in Europe and North America, and I should add, other trading countries, prices are still very low, and that in itself could be a bit of a barrier to providing new capacity to the market. I think our view at SC Insights, and this is across the board, is that raw material prices have probably reached pretty close to their nadir across lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite as well. And that's largely because, you can't really incentivize a lot of these industries to double their production in the way that they will need to double their production at today's price levels. Most of the sentiment in the industry at the moment is that battery prices have been falling, and that therefore that will obviously continue to fall. And it's the same voices saying that who said that would happen until we got to 2022, when a raw material price shock forced prices up. So I think in our view, looking at the numbers recently, probably battery cell costs on average, the global average, obviously by plant it can be slightly different, will increase in 2025 versus 2024. And if they don't, then you get an even bigger increase in late 25 or early 26. So the supply demand fundamentals there are not completely aligned at the moment. So there are sort of final thoughts on the anode supply chain. We do have quite a few questions to get through, so let's start having a look through some of those. The first one, is there any volume loss in synthetic graphite as well? Yes, there is. It's a lot less than in natural. I think generally about 1.25 tons per ton would be a sort of rule of thumb volume loss there. Next question. Since synthetic graphite is essentially a byproduct of oil and gas refining, why aren't European or American refineries looking at the potential to add this as additional revenue source? So oil refining economics are incredibly complicated, but one of the main reasons is that some of those oils are not particularly suitable. In some cases, you would have to redesign the rest of the refinery, and these are assets which cost billions and billions of dollars. So it may not make that much sense to add another couple of $100 million in revenue versus the investment. And also, it's worth pointing out that that material at the moment, most of it would have to go to China. So it doesn't solve your national security question if you just have the raw material but not the processing capacity. The things need to be taken into account. Otherwise, you get into a situation again like we had in rare earths, where they reopened the Mountain Pass mine in California, but didn't have the processing side, so they had to ship the material to China to then ship back. It doesn't really sort of open your. In fact, it makes it worse. You do two ships rather than one. For the national security point of view. Michael, please.
If I could just add there, sort of on the European refining perspective, one, there is a fairly major refinery in the UK, P66's Humber refinery, which is producing battery grade graphite, which is quite significant in terms of supply. But it's quite a rarity. The problem is for a lot of refineries, they don't produce the right kind of needle coke, certainly fine enough and pure enough grade to be used in their coking unit. And as Andy alluded to, trying to make an investment decision in a coking unit, which is probably the worst and hardest part of a refinery to make profitable, is just something I think most oil and gas companies, most refining companies, petro companies will just not be that interested in doing. Also, they're not going to want to touch their environmental permitting at the moment, being an oil refinery. They're dirty enough as they are, and trying to reopen it with, today's views on petrochemicals. I just think for most it would be too much of a regulatory risk to touch.
And you could also be cynical and say, why would they want to help their competing industry? So next question, what are the Capex for these natural and synthetic graphite processing plants, and what percentage of EU and US demand per plant do they take? Obviously, plants with different sizes. I mean, typically you're looking between sort of 20 and 60,000 tons an asset. Obviously, you've then got to look at what proportion of that goes into what anode to see what the energy density is of that anode as to what portion of demand that it takes. Likewise, huge range in terms of the Capex. It could be 50 million, it could be 200 million, but it's not in the billions of dollars. Typically you're not dealing with investments on the size of the battery cell plant itself, a little bit lower than on the cathode side. So very wide range in the answers there, but there's a very wide range in the answer. Question here, Ontario specifically has seen many battery plants invested in the province and backed by government funding, as Mike, you alluded to in one of your slides. I believe these plants were committed to sourcing graphite and looking for local sources. Is that correct? And where will they get these materials if currently no producing mines exist? Michael, I'll pass on to you in a moment for this question, but as I say, going back to one of my early answers, if you have your natural graphite mine and no anode producer, then it's very difficult. And a lot of the natural graphite mines are now coming to mind. If you look at Vermont Graphite, they have the mine, they have the processing facility, and now they have the anode active material consideration as well. So either you have to bring that in-house and do all of the processing, and the skill sets for mining are very different to the skill sets for processing, should be mentioned, or you just import the material. So, a lot of people at the moment will be importing material from South Korea, or planning to import material from South Korea, and facing the headache that actually the graphite that the South Koreans are using is coming from China quite often, which under US rules can cut you out from some of the subsidies and incentives. Mike?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think this is very much a case of, you know, a lot of these plants are going to get material from where they can find it initially. Um, the sort of the crude mass, if you like, is it takes you about 3 years to get a factory built. It takes you 7 years to get a mine built if you're quick. So I think for a lot of the sort of development you're seeing in places like Ontario, there will be, a sort of a willingness to try and find locally sourced material when it becomes available. But I'm not convinced it will be, we'll see a lot of Canadian mined lithium in going through those Ontario plants anytime soon. There will probably be a rush to get feedstock that's derived from mines in places like Australia and Chile in the shorter term, possibly Argentina in the future. But I think a lot of the aim for an integrated local supply chain is it's still very much an aim. A deliverable is a decade at least in the future. I think if it gets there, given the sort of the absolutely massive rate of subsidy that's being paid and how long the political will is to sustain that.
And what effect would a Trump presidency have on the EV supply chain? I mean, there are a couple of things, and you could probably do a whole webinar on this itself. For me, the biggest one is we're starting to see the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a signature piece of Biden administration's legislative achievements, wanting to walk that back, wanting to walk back some of the subsidies, wanting to basically neuter large parts of the funding organisations, such as the Loan Programme Office. That's a possibility. It seems to be, in the narrative at the moment. That could obviously slow things down. Uncertainty around that could also slow things down when people are deciding what financing routes they're going down. The one flip side to that is most of the funding has been in Republican-controlled states so far when it comes to Inflation Reduction Act spending or planned spending. You've then also got potential increase in the US-China trade war. Talks of an import tax on Chinese materials. I mean, to be honest, it's very similar to talks of Chinese export restrictions. The net result's the same. It doesn't matter who's banning it or making it more expensive. But if you're adding a cost, that cost will ultimately be borne by not just the automotive manufacturer, but also the end user. So what we could see is a bit of a walk back then in targets for electric vehicles and targets for electrification. Very bad for if your considerations are on climate change and things like this. But I think the Trump administration is likely to put money before climate considerations, and was largely what we saw in the first term. But yeah, who knows? It'll be interesting to see what happens. Interesting in the sort of Chinese proverb way. They live in interesting times. Links to slides that will be provided, as mentioned, after the seminar. Mike, did you have anything to mention on a potential Republican administration taking over in 25?
I think it will depend entirely on also who's got which part of the house. That will make a very big difference too. I'm not sure what I wouldn't like to call that in some ways. It's too finely balanced. We've got too many grandees of both parties departing to sort of see what's really going to happen. I think in both Senate and lower house, we're going to see some quite big changes. So yeah, though I must admit the idea of not supporting American jobs doesn't seem to sit terribly well with most US legislators. So I would rather say if it is scaled back, possibly they might make it a little harder to qualify for the grants or the loans. But I don't see it going away in its entirety by any means. I think it will still largely be intact.
And next question, what is SC Insights' opinion on anode processors at the moment, committing to conditional offtakes at a price of 4.5 to 5.5 per kilogram, which could render the majority of these projects unfundable? Considering also that the offtakes are fixed pricing for 3 to 5 years, is there an anode producer consortium that could be created to help address this issue as a group. I think this would fall under the sort of various critical minerals talking shops that we have around the world. I'd hate to see yet another batch of these critical minerals or anode things being created just because I find them often largely a waste of time. You're absolutely right, though, that pricing today, and as I mentioned, is very low. Will have to increase to incentivize new supply. So I think what we've seen is that some of the OEMs who are a bit further ahead on their thinking in this recognize that they will have to pay more for non-Chinese material, at least in the short term, potentially the medium term. So yeah, the pricing environment is not supportive at the moment. But if you want to ring fence yourself and you get the subsidies, then you're going to have to pay more. Now, that does mean actually that if you get your tax credits and the vehicle credits as well, that you can afford to pay more because that's offset by getting those credits. You get paid back for not taking Chinese material, for taking local or free trade partner material. So yeah, that sort of bifurcation in the market, I think, is what's happening at the moment. But yeah, they're not simple economic decisions to make, and it means that the industry outside of China needs to be supported by legislation, which it is today and to date. So any threat to that is a threat to the supply chain. Next one. Don't think OEMs understand that by securing these types of prices, they're not guaranteeing that their supply will survive. That's absolutely true. I think OEMs are a little bit more mature now than they were sort of say 15 years ago, or even 10 years ago, when they're quite often just trying to bankrupt their suppliers by forcing margins down as much as possible. I think when you're dealing with these take or pay offtakes now, people will look at that and say, are you sustainable in my supply chain? Because what I'm really concerned about is security of supply, even more than security of price. And the semiconductor shortage that we saw over a couple of years has wizened them to that. So it varies by OEM, but I think many of them do have that on their radar. We've got for reference the ICC Sino and NFO pricing floats around $8.5 per kilogram. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to anode pricing and anode raw material, particularly anode pricing, you've got to look at what anode you're considering as to what its price is. So I think the benchmarks that you see in China, where you actually have some liquid trade, are not necessarily the types of pricing benchmarks that you would end up using outside of China. One for you, Mike. Can you expand on the EU's CRMA, particularly which projects would likely be considered on the anode supply chain as strategic? Do you have any timeframes on when the legislation comes into force?
So one thing I think to point out is a lot of the targets the EU set out are not actually really legislatively binding. They are targets more like aspirations rather than anything legal weight. I think that's very worth noting. I think also commenting on which projects are strategic is quite difficult. I'm not sure the European Commission or the European Parliament, if it ever got that high, would ever really have an opinion on which projects particularly. And the reason I say that is if you look at how the funding is allocated, the funding is actually allocated by member states and is paid for by member states. It is then approved by the European Union. So I'm not really sure they've necessarily got what you'd call a concrete list of what would be strategic projects. They might have a rough idea of what they'd like to see, but I'm not sure it's anything that you'd find on any sort of EU civil servant's desk in Brussels. There probably are some which will become more strategic and sort of how that pans out with development, but I'm not sure you'd ever sort of find a real sort of list or serious set of industry negotiation liaison that would point to sort of a set of strategic facilities and strategic partners in that way.
Sure. How quickly can Chinese operators adapt to low carbon requirements that Europe is asking for? In many respects, they already have been. So a lot of the anode supply chain and processing and anode active material in China has moved to provinces with high renewables. So primarily that's moving from Inner Mongolia, where a lot of the power comes from coal, to say Sichuan province, where a lot of it comes from hydro. And I think that Chinese operators will, they've got a choice, right? You've got high carbon supply, low carbon supply in terms of emissions, and they can export the low carbon supply. So I think any barrier on Chinese supply based on greenhouse gas emissions in the anode side would have very little impact. You may charge a premium for it, but the Chinese, have been planning for this for quite a while, and they will be able to find that low carbon supply to ship in. Which index could you recommend for natural synthetic graphite on a pricing mechanism? I say there's two choices you can use. You can use a Chinese, or you can do a cost plus. There are some other companies who do pricing, such as fast markets or benchmark. It's up to you to consider whether there's enough liquidity in those prices at the moment for them to be representative. But again, that's something we work with our clients on a consulting basis quite a lot. Mid-range long-term forecast regarding market balances. Yes, we do. Again, it's something that's made available to our clients. What I would say, as with many of these markets, there's a global surplus and a regional deficit outside of China. That's basically what you see. And certainly on the anode side, it's a huge number of announcements. There's far more capacity than you need. And really what we will probably need to see is some of those Chinese companies start investing outside of China. And that would also solve some of the skilled labour requirements as well. What impact would sodium ion have on these value chains? So sodium ion typically uses a hard carbon rather than a graphite type thing. So effectively, the more, again, a bit of a high level, the more market share that sodium ion takes, the less of the less material you need going into, less graphite you need going into the monetary value chain. Why do you think share price has not reflected success of offtake agreements? I mean, I can't really comment on individual companies' share prices. What I would say is, the offtake agreements are one part of what you need. You need the offtake agreements almost to get the funding, and when you start moving close to production, you will move the share price higher. Also, if there's a view that the offtake, and I don't know on the individual specifics on individual companies, if there's a view that it is on a cost plus basis, then obviously the return on capital will be slightly different to if it is linked to a market price. Market price is lower than you would make money on, then again, it might not move the share price. Consider a Republican takeover would depend on Senate and House, extremely difficult to walk back laws. Yeah, I think we can take that one as a comment for the US. And yeah, what I would say is, while they don't have to necessarily walk back the Inflation Reduction Act, you can change some of the guidance, and you can change some of the people who make the decisions on awarding funding or not. That can be done on an executive basis rather than having to have the legislature involved. Right, two more questions, and then we're going to be over time already. We'll do the last two questions. I think you mentioned seeing anode prices likely rising in 2025. Can you speak more to planned production and expansions going on in China and elsewhere in the short and mid-term, and how that impacts your predictions for supply and demand? Yeah, I think I sort of addressed most of that earlier. The number of expansions in China are just crazy. There's no way they will meet. They need that much capacity. I suspect you'll see some consolidation. It's what we would call an overheated sector already. And I say, I think what you really need to look at is the balances in Europe, the balances in North America and elsewhere, rather than just the global one. Because globally, there's plenty of material potential for supply disruption for environmental reasons in China that can have a large impact, because the synthetic side, as I say, is not really that price elastic when it comes to increasing production. Finally, price volatility risk battery materials can be managed by common specification contracts and hedging contracts. But yeah, anode lacks a common industry specification. How do you think about mitigating price risk for anode? Very difficult to mitigate price risk. You can do it with some kind of fixed term contract, but we're many years away from having liquid futures exchange where you can manage price risk. That will take a long time in this industry. This industry is a few years behind where say lithium is in the battery raw materials, and even there you can't do that yet. So you mitigate that risk by in your individual term sheet and contracts by knowing who you're buying from and who you're selling to, and what the financial health of each part of that consumer and supplier relationship is. But again, happy to advise on that, and feel free to reach out if you want a more fulfilling answer. Finally, considering Latin America does not have Chinese import-export restrictions, could it be viable to consider a mixed chain, referring to mixed Chinese imports and domestic production? This is it's something we could see, but if you look at the US legislation, that cuts out Chinese or foreign entity of concern raw materials from some of the subsidies. So even if you were processing this material in Brazil, Mexico, Chile, you still wouldn't necessarily get all of the subsidies that you require. And yeah, Mike, any final thoughts before we end for the day?
No, I don't think so, but thank you very much for having me on. It's been really enjoyable.
Yeah, thanks all. And I say any final comments you'd like to send us, please do. You can find information on us by scanning the QR code there, and I'm sure one of my colleagues would love to get in touch with you. Thank you.